What we saw, I thought, were five spectacular briefings, so let's give all of our briefers at one time a round of applause. And I hope you'll do this in your class next week with your group, but I want to reflect a little bit on what we've just done and what we've just seen. Because what you've seen today is pretty unique in American higher education. There is no public policy program in the United States that requires students to take 12 points of environmental science. Your beginnings of policy analysis reflect scientific input, which will stay with us through next semester. What we focused on this semester, and I think is obvious from your work, is on understanding and communicating the scientific issues that are needed to understand this kind of public policy problem. So the environment and sustainability is a kind of public policy problem that requires an understanding of science in order to really produce a reasonable policy outcome. If you were studying poverty, you would need to know sociology, you would need to know a variety of other disciplinary backgrounds. You need to know social psychology. There are a whole variety of underlying disciplines. If you were studying transportation, you need to know a little bit more about engineering. But this particular field requires the kinds of things that you were learning. And because most of the decision makers do not have this background, there's a particular burden on those of us who work in this area to translate from the scientific expertise to the decision makers. And so every briefing that you just saw here was structured in such a way that you didn't need scientific background to understand what was going on in the policy problem and solution. Now, you now will take that for granted, but as you go out in the world, you're going to see very few people can do what you do. And so what you just saw were 5 examples of that. So what else did we do this summer? We delivered analysis under very tight deadlines. There were no incompletes in workshop. The train leaves the station, either you're on the train or you're not. And so every week the output had to be produced. And that's a lot like the way work goes. You don't just come into work and say, well, Senator, I know that the committee hearings today, but my dog ate it. Or we didn't have the time to finish it, but we were so interested in a quality product, we need a few more days. Now the senator gets to say that to you, but you don't get to say that to the senator. And so you learned how to produce high quality work under tight deadlines within a structure you may not have liked all the time or even agreed with all the time, but you learned how to work with it. So even these performance measurements, we're going to look at performance measurement again in the fall in a very different way. At this point, we're focusing on scientific measures. In the fall, we're going to talk about performance measurement as management people talk about it and think about it, which is a different kind of piece of analysis. But underlying it for you, there'll always be this recollection, oh, wait a minute, we need at least a couple of scientific indicators as part of our performance measurement system. And structure itself is hard to work within. Academics hate it, but policy analysts and management analysts require it because organizations and public policy have to fit into certain structures and rhythms, and you have to be able to do it. I often think about it the same way I think about pop songs, and you may hear me say this from time to time. You know, every song that you hear on the radio has the same exact musical structure. It has a chorus, it has a verse, a chorus, what's called a middle 8, which is 8 bars of music, and then another verse and a chorus. Every song, thousands of songs. And yet the goal of a songwriter is to do all that within 3 minutes and to have it be something that you remember. That kind of structure, a lot of people don't like. You know, I mean, so jazz musicians don't use it. They do other things, and they don't make very much money doing it usually. So the idea is to be able to do this work within a structure to make it more easily understood and communicated. And that puts the burden on the analyst and on the group to produce under that structure. And you've done that, and you've done that very successfully. Every one of these briefings was 10 minutes and under. And it wasn't always fun to get to that 10 minutes and under. Sometimes you had to give up material that you really understood pretty well, and you thought was important, but you have to make that choice, and so you did that. You also learned to work together, which I hope you're finding to be an enjoyable experience, but whether you do or you don't, you still have to do it. I'm in work groups as a professional with people I could do without. Nobody here, of course. But that's part of work. And sometimes you need a kind of expertise that you then compromise some of the things you would put into a standard for who would be in a group because you need that kind of expertise. So you learn to do that. You also were learning by doing. You learned an awful lot of science this semester in this class, even though, arguably only 2 of us were scientists. The rest of us do other things. But you learned science, and often you taught us science. My group taught me science. Every semester, every summer semester, I learn from the students about the science behind the problem and solution, things that I didn't know before. And it has to be explained to me because the last chemistry I took was in 1972. I think I was a sophomore in college. So that was a long time ago, and I don't remember anything about it. So I require this kind of instruction. That's a very important thing for you to learn how to communicate, and you did it very, very successfully. But learning by doing, in the process of producing all of these outputs, you taught each other, you taught us, you learned yourself a lot of facts about the science behind these problems and solutions. You also learned about the problem itself and how it sits in the world. Next semester, we'll be doing the same thing in terms of how do we set up a program to address these issues. And next semester, when we we'll go back and look at these bills again in a different way. We'll be looking at it in terms of how it gets implemented and the management issues and the political issues and all of the things that go from this great idea to what you can actually do. So here's the thing, you made a lot of compromises in learning the problem and putting it into the structure. When you actually put a bill in motion, you start implementing a program, you go from all these 50 terrific ideas to the 3 things you're actually going to do in 2016. And that's what the fall semester is devoted to, deciding what are those 3 things and how do we get them started. And so you're now prepared to do that. I'm really encouraged by what I just saw. I think you did a spectacular job. I think that very often students that go through this are not quite aware of how much you've actually learned and how much your colleagues have learned. But believe me, think a little bit about what you knew about these issues when we first introduced them a couple of days after Memorial Day, and think about how much more you know about them now. So with that, I know you have a few other exams coming up and papers due, Professor Johnson, is that right? And so there's still plenty of coffee yet left. I suggest you have some of it, and congratulations. I'll see you at your party in a couple of days.